can, oh, wait a minute. Got a headset. Crap, I forgot. Sorry. Alrighty, good morning. I'm gonna come on here and babble. I'm good at that. I got stuck this last week. I did a drop-off late Wednesday night, and I got stuck in Alabama, which is a horrible place for expediting. And I spent a couple of days, Thursday, Friday, waiting around for something to happen, and it didn't. And I was very fortunate that Saturday I headed up into Tennessee and got a load coming up into Indiana, which got me moving over a week. Otherwise, I would have been stuck Saturday, Sunday, which would have been 4 days. And based on the severe lack of cargo happening in Alabama, I probably would have been stuck even longer. So, oh, what's going on here? Whoa, brake lights, hold on. Somebody hit the wall. Whoa. Yep, somebody got blasted right there. Whoa. Anyway, last night here, Sunday night, in the town of Lebanon, Illinois, and I got a call first thing to go pick up an Indy, which is right down the street. I have a single pallet, and I'm going to the town of Normal, Illinois. And I'm trying to get out of Indy here in a mile. I'm sorry, I'm distracted for a second. And that guy got blasted back there. Hold on just a second. For exit 16 Bravo, West 74 to Peoria. Oh, crap. It's in my blind spot. Hold on. There we go. Now you've moved. Over. Give me a second here. Sorry, my brain is in another place right now. I got a direct, it's only 150 something miles. I got to be there at noon. Pretty quick. Roll out. Okay, no. I should roll out here and it should be a straight shot. Alright, well, the topic, again, I babble on here. My wife says I lecture. I don't know, maybe I do. I just get all these different ideas in my head. I kind of put them all together and come up with something to talk about. They give credit to the first controlled flight to the Wright brothers in 1903, which is true. The key word is controlled. In 1901, there was a guy in New Zealand that built something that was an airplane, but it wasn't controllable. When it took off, he could get it to go off the ground and fly a short distance, and then it would almost immediately crash. It would stall out and crash. So technically, it wasn't a controlled flight. It was just flight. But the Wright brothers had a plane that could take off and land. And the first flight they ever made was 120 feet. And as the joke goes, at the end of that 120 feet, they couldn't find their luggage. Sorry. Anyway, that's 1903. Now you fast forward to 1914, which is when World War I kicked off. Not for the United States, but in Europe. And they already had airplanes. I mean, fully functional operational airplanes. They were dangerous and they were kites, but they were functional and they flew them all over the place. And if you go back to like the American Civil War, they used hot air balloons. Observation go straight up in the air, and they had a guy with a telescope, and he'd be, all right, now I got to speed up and go around this guy because he keeps going faster and faster. Hold on a second. Here we go. Okay, there. If I go 80 miles an hour, am I out of your way? Thank you. Jeez. Like a speed, dude. Anyway, they used them as for observation, and during World War I, it was kind of the same thing, except they used airplanes for observation. World War I, of course, stalemated into trench warfare, and each side will always want to see what the other side's doing, so they sent out these reconnaissance planes, which consisted, you think of the World War I bi-wing aircraft, and they had a pilot, and then behind him there was a compartment for a guy with a camera. I've got 3, 1, 2, 3. Hi to everybody out there, Christopher. What's going on, mister? Like I said, morning drive. And the observer had a camera that the size of a suitcase, and they would fly over enemy lines, and the guy would literally hang over the side of the aircraft and point straight down and take pictures. And you got to remember, the planes back then went, 90 or 100 miles an hour. They were just barely moving through the sky. And both sides would do it, would do the aerial reconnaissance. And what would happen is planes would fly by each other. Here's the Western and the Axis. They'd fly by and they'd wave. Hey, how you doing? Because they're kind of a rarity. Aviation was so new, they just wave. They're just being friendly. And then one day, somebody brought a handgun and flew next to or flew by the guy on the other side and fired a shot. Which, of course, the next time they met, both were firing shots at each other. And then the guy in the back seat, the photographer, with a handgun, would fire a shot, and they go by. He would concentrate. They'd basically shoot. Nobody ever hit anything, but they would fire handguns at each other, so the camaraderie in the air had gone away by then. And there was a development, and I've seen a picture of this. It's kind of fascinating. Somebody made a box that would hold 10 handguns. Semi-automatic handguns. You put them in, load them, and it had one trigger, and you would aim this box that was maybe a foot tall, maybe a foot and a half wide, and you pull the trigger, and it would fire all 10 rounds at once, and it was attached to the guy in the back. He was behind the pilot. He would aim this box and shoot at the other guy trying to hit him. And again, no records of any hits or anything that happened. Anybody got killed with that. But eventually, they mounted a machine gun in the back of the aircraft. The guy in the rear had the photographer, the observer, had a machine gun. And they would swivel mount and shoot. And eventually, I think there was the first air-to-air kill. I think it was a British guy that shot down a German plane. I believe was the original air-to-air kill. And from there, they started making dedicated fighter planes where there was a forward-firing machine gun that was mounted on the wing. Remember, it's a bi-wing, or in the Germans' case, sometimes a tri-wing, but they put the weapon above the wing, so the pilot would swoop in behind whatever he was shooting at, and he would have to reach up with his left hand and pull the trigger like up over his head. Awkward. And then the Germans developed an interrupter where you could fire it through the propeller blades. It's kind of a genius design. And a German plane was shot down, and the Brits captured it, went through it, figured out how they did it, and they copied the design. That's pretty common in warfare. But that's where air-to-air combat got started. And one of the most successful pilots in World War I was Erich von Ribbentrop, the Red Baron, von Ribbentrop. He had 80 kills. And it was weird how they counted kills. You had to shoot the enemy down, but they had to crash on your side of the lines, which I don't get that. But if you shot somebody down and they crashed and survived, the pilot who shot them down would usually land and get out, and they would discuss the fight with each other. It was really weird how they did it back then. But that's how that got started. So that's first generation fighter planes for World War I. And then World War II planes, they take what they've learned and they've developed. They go to the monowing planes in the 1930s. And World War II, the development of aircraft skyrocketed, and they got weapons in the wings and more sophisticated systems. Generation 3 were the first fighter planes, the MiG-15 by the Soviets, the American F-80 Shooting Star. And then they went Gen 4, which is the planes you see today, the F-18s, the F-14s, F-16, that's Gen 4. Gen 5 now is the new F-22s, only garbage. Well, they're always looking for a bigger, better, faster way to shoot a plane down. And in 1949, China had a revolution. They had a war with themselves. The nationalists and the communists fought. And the communists beat the nationalists out, mainly because the nationalists, the level of corruption was so incredible. They were stealing money and diverting stuff, and they kind of shot themselves in the foot a little bit. The nationalists moved out to the island of Formosa, which is now called Taiwan, and set up the Chinese Republic. There's mainland China, the communists, and there's Taiwan, that's not the ROC, that's Taiwan, but they're the other Chinese, and they've been at it ever since. Even today, there's tension between the two countries. Well, the late 1950s, mid to late 1950s, Taiwan and the Republic of China, or the big China, were going at it. They were fighting each other over control because they don't like the idea that part of the country broke off and did their own thing. Hold on a second. And in 1958, they were going at it, and the mainland Chinese had the MiG-17, which at that time was like the newest plane on the block, and it was fairly competent for what it was. The Taiwanese military were flying F-86 Sabre jets, which was the darling of the Korean War a few years earlier, but technology keeps moving, so by 1958, the F-86 Sabre was kind of long in the tooth and was starting to show its weaknesses against the newer generation of fighters. So the mainland China, the Republic of China, had the upper hand over the Taiwanese, and they're going into combat. And, hold on a second. In air-to-air combat, the guy that's higher up has the advantage. That's just speed and altitude advantage. And it was in 1958 when the Chinese, the Republic of China pilots were going air-to-air, and they're being controlled to be watched by radar, and the Soviets are invested in this because this is their weapon system, and there's advisors watching as it's going on, and making sure the pilots are doing the right thing, because they're basically showcasing Soviet hardware. And this Chinese pilot looks down, sees this Taiwanese F-86, and he's going to start his dive, and he looks over his wingman, and his wingman explodes. Poof, gone. And he starts jinking and jiving around the sky because he's assuming he's getting shot at, because the only two ways back then to shoot somebody down, air to air, is gunfire or very primitive radar-guided missiles, which were new. And you have radar warning receivers on board, so if someone's shooting at you, well, there's no warning receiver. He doesn't see an enemy plane, and when you shoot at somebody with bullets, you see the bullets. You just don't fire one bullet, hit the target, blow it up. You fire a whole bunch of bullets, and you see them flying by your cockpit. Well, this guy didn't see anything, but he starts jinking and jiving, looking around. There's nobody else up there, and he's like, what just happened? And then another pilot in his flight comes up on the radio and says, my wingman just disappeared. So it happened twice. They don't know why, but they just lost two planes to these F-86s that are actually lower than they are. And they return to base, and they go, what's going on? I go, we don't know. And the Soviets, and this is a common trait worldwide. When somebody who wasn't involved in an event, who's sitting behind a desk, here's something they don't like, they just dismiss it as it didn't happen. It just doesn't fit my preconceived notions. So, you don't know what you're talking about. You just didn't see the plane that shot you down, and you're a coward, and you're incompetent. It's the usual approach. Well, this continued to happen. They continued to lose planes, and they couldn't figure out how or why it was happening. And there were theories which included sabotage, mechanical, somebody's planting a bomb inside the plane. They didn't know what was causing it. And then one pilot says, I lost my wingman and I saw something that looked like a cigarette coming towards the plane and hit it. So they go, okay, it's some kind of a missile. And he goes, it looked like a rocket. But their radar warning systems didn't pick it up. They go, well, how is it possible that you could shoot a rocket? Because you just remember, a rocket and a missile, a rocket has no guidance. It just flies in a straight line and goes boom until it hits something. A missile has some kind of a guidance system. And they go, it was a rocket, but when the plane turned, it turned with it. And he goes, yeah, that doesn't happen. Rockets don't turn. So the Soviets came up with a theory that there was some kind of a laser beam, and they could not, for the life of them, figure out what was causing this. And then one day, the Chinese pilots got paranoid and would stop engaging the F-86s because they said they're shooting us down and we don't know how they're doing it. So there was an upheaval in the air war. And then one day, a Chinese pilot was flying, and his plane got physically hit. Got knocked around, and the plane was damaged, but it was flyable, and he flew back to base and landed. And there was a missile stuck into his airframe, like take a pencil and stab, a cardboard box. there's a missile stuck in the side, and it was one of these cigarettes they're talking about. That the warhead didn't work; it just was a dud. So now they have what has been blowing them up, and they pulled it apart, and that's when they saw it was the first generation, first concept heat-seeking missile, which the Soviets had no concept for this. And it was designed by a guy out in California who worked for the Defense Department. He came with this idea, and he showed the military, hey, look, I could make a heat seeker on this. And they were like, yeah, we're not interested. So he went home and built it in his garage. Now, I'm not going to pretend I understand the technology of a heat-seeking missile, but apparently it was a very, very simple concept. It was a missile with flippers that could steer itself. But the seeker was, and this is their words, a heat-detecting crystal. Don't ask me. In that crystal, they put a mirror on it that was off-center. It wasn't level. The mirror would spin, but it warbled kind of. And the way the crystal worked is it liked having the heat source in the middle of that warbling mirror. So if the heat source moved to one side, the missile, the seeker would turn the missile towards it. So no matter what it did, it would track it. Oh, here we go. So the Soviets got their hands on it. They tried to mimic it, and that's something they're famous for. It's called reverse engineering, where you have somebody else's technology, you have somebody else's equipment, and you just try to deconstruct it and figure out what makes it work. And the Soviets are famous for doing that. And it's a form of cheating. On the other hand, it also means you're behind, because if you're copying something the enemy has, that means they already have it. And by the time they've copied it, it's already yesterday's news, and the enemy's onto something else. And that's kind of how they copied the atomic weapons. They copied the Stinger. They copied a bunch of missiles. I mean, the Cyclone, but they copied all kinds of stuff. That's how they operated. So they made a copy of it, and they did step by step, but their quality of how they built them apparently was a lot less. And they used them going forward, and they weren't very effective. I mean, they were like, their kill rate was incredibly small. The original heat-seeking missile kind of had a low kill rate, but the Soviet version was much, much, much less due to its sensitivity. And from there, the heat-seeking missiles continued forward. They started making different versions of them. And there was one in the 60s and 70s. It was to be shot from the ground. It was called a red-eye. And it was a heat-seeking warhead, and the fatal flaw of the red-eye is you couldn't shoot it at an aircraft coming at you. You could only shoot it at an aircraft leaving. So you're in a hole, you're in the ground, and here comes an enemy fighter bomber or whatever is diving on you. You had to wait for it to shoot you up and drop bombs, and then you had to shoot at it as it left, which that's okay. So that's where they developed the Stinger missile, and the Stinger missile, which has been in production since 1980. There's probably 10 generations of it by now. That's what the Stinger missile came into being, as a portable launch from all directions. And there was a bunch of argument over the technology, and the basic concept is it's a heat-seeking missile, and it has, and again, this may be different today, but my knowledge of the Stinger is just kind of small. It had a CO2 bottle on it, and you had to screw the bottle in, and it would pop a hole, and it would cool the head, and you had about 40 seconds. You had to actually pull the trigger, or the coolant would die off, and the missile wouldn't work after that. Now I think it is you screw the head, you leave it, and then you just pull a big handle, and it pops the bottle, so there's none of this screwed in stuff. I think that's one of the things they changed, but they're probably more sophisticated. They're limited to 5,000 meters, which is about 50,000 feet, something like that. So it's a Mach 5 missile. But basically, what you're doing is you're looking at a target, and people will say, "Oh, the heat-seeking missile chases the aircraft exhaust." No, it doesn't. It chases the motor. You might have 700 degrees of jet exhaust, but the engine's like 4,000 degrees. The center of the engine. So that's where the missile's going. And it's that's its target. So they gave these missiles, they trained Afghan tribesmen how to use them. And And there was some theory that American military people weren't smart enough to figure out how to use them, but this illiterate yak herder in Afghanistan could figure it out. I mean, yeah, they started handing those over to the Afghanis to shoot down. And basically, the concept is you acquire your target, you look, you pull the seeker head, and there's two seeker heads, and when they agree, they agree on a target. What happens is you're holding it against your face, and there is a piece of the pad that touches your cheekbone, and it causes your head to be a tuning fork. So there could be battlefield noise going around. If you can't hear it, well, when it's touching your skull and your skull starts to ring, you know it's working. So you get this tone in your head as your, like I said, your brain is now, your skull is now a tuning fork. And you hear it go, wee, that sound, and now it's time to fire. So you pull the trigger, it launches, a launch motor throws the missile out of the tube. It accelerates to Mach 2, Mach 3. And then it starts its seeker. So in the Afghan war, what the Soviets started doing is dropping flares from there. They would just strap a flare dispenser. But the Stinger has, without going into classified information, it has a very limited field of view when you're aiming it, and once it's acquired its target, its field of view shrinks noticeably. And how it works basically is if it's locked onto a target and that thing's going towards it, if flares are actually hotter for a split second than the engine, as soon as something hotter goes off, the missile basically blinks. And if that hot thing is still there, it'll chase it. The problem is, in that split second, the flare is away from the airframe, and then it goes back to its original target. So the Soviets started dropping flares, and it didn't make a difference. It just doesn't care. It will go up the middle of the boom. That's what it was designed to do. And something, I talked about this a long time ago, but I don't think I streamed about it. When I joined the Army in 86, I crewed tanks. And in 89, I found out about the flight school program. And I went through the process of being qualified to apply, and then applying and getting through it and getting accepted, which knocked me sideways. So May of 89, I went to the Army Flight School. And in the middle of our training, one of the classes they took us to was about the Stinger missile. They were just talking about it. They bring you into a classroom, and they lock the door, and they open a little safe to get this VHS tape out. And the students in the class, they used to advertise on TV, you can go from high school to flight school. Yeah, that's extremely unusual. The people that are in flight school are military members that have been in the military and went to flight school later on. They just don't walk off the street. There were a couple, but it's unusual. But they come from all these different areas. I mean, there's no pattern to where they got these people. We had one guy who was the band leader, and he got to flight school, for instance. Then you had mechanics. And we had a couple of guys in the class that were Green Berets that had gone in there. So we're in this class, and they're showing these videos shot in Afghanistan, showing how the missile works and what it can and can't do. And a guy, they had this one where there's these two guys in civilian clothes in the mountains of Afghanistan, and they have this Stinger missile in its little carrying case, and the case is open, and there are tribesmen standing around looking at it. And this guy's got a stick, and he's pointing at components, and he's talking, and there's a translator, and the translator's saying, this, that, the next thing. And the two civilians are standing there, one's facing the camera, one's facing away from the camera. And then you hear a couple of rifle shots, and the camera's looking around, everybody starts scrambling. One of those Mi-24 Soviet attack helicopters is flying by out here in the distance. And everybody's running for cover, and the camera kind of runs behind a rock, pokes up, looks back, and the second civilian is holding the missile on his shoulder and fires it. And you could watch, it wasn't that far of a shot, and the missile flew towards the helicopter, turned, I don't know why, but it hit the front end of the aircraft, and it blew the cockpit off, and the aircraft pitched nose high, and then fell out of sight, and there's a crash boom, you see the smoke come up from where it crashed. And everybody starts jumping up and down excited because they've got a weapon that can, these aircraft have been tearing them up for the last few years. And the camera goes back, And the guy that shot the missile drops it to his side, and somebody in the classroom says, "Hey, Howie, isn't that you?" And the guy in the film is sitting next to me in class. And the instructor turns the light on, and there's Howie, green beret, white as a sheet. And he's like, So the first Stinger shot of the Afghan-Soviet war was shot by the guy sitting next to me in the chair. And I thought that was kind of crazy. And I just caught a documentary yesterday talking about the Gulf War I. And again, this is 1991, and this was the death throes of the Soviet Union. Remember, they went out of business the tail end of the 90s. The whole Soviet Union collapsed. But they were still in business when the Gulf War happened. And they were invested in the Iraqi military. They were invested in their Soviet MiG-29, MiG-25, MiG-31, whatever fighter planes they had to fight the United States. They've got their radar systems, they've got their instructor pilots, they're watching closely to see what's happening. So the air war starts, and the Soviets are watching as all these Iraqi pilots take off and start flying towards the direction of the coalition, and they're each marked on the radar screen. There's 10 of them, and all of a sudden one of them disappears off the screen, and he goes, "Well, what happened?" And is there a glitch? And they try to call him on the radio, and he doesn't respond. And then another one disappears, and then another one disappears, and there's no aircraft in the area. There's no radar signal. There's nothing. They're just disappearing. And they didn't find out until later they were getting shot down by F-15s firing 1960s vintage Sparrow air-to-air radar-guided missiles. And when you shoot a radar-guided missile, it is transmitting, so you're in your plane and you can hear it. It's setting off your sensors, and you've got buzzers. You know it's coming, and there's a pulse to it, and as it gets closer, the pulse gets quicker. You know it's getting close, and then you evade, and then you jam the missile. You put out jammers and chaff and all kinds of stuff. Pop chaff that makes a cloud, looks like an aircraft turn away. There's all kinds of maneuvers you do when you're getting painted with radar. And what was happening is F-15s in the distance outside of their zone were being directed by AWACS planes to fire these radar-guided missiles in the direction of these planes. And the AWACS plane was setting data link down to the missile, steering the missile through satellite control while the radar was turned off on the missile. And then when it got super close, they would go, "Okay, go active." So the Iraqi pilots are flying along, and all of a sudden the radar warning goes off, and 1 second later, blam, the missile slams them. They have no warning it's happening. They don't have enough time to react to it. So that's the new form of air-to-air combat. The stuff's out there flying around, sneaking up on you, and you don't even know it's there until it's there. It's right in your tail by proximity detonator. Flies close by, it senses it's close, and it goes off like a bomb. Whereas an old radio like World War II piston engine radio, they'll take some damage. Turbine engine, you get one piece of metal in a turbine engine, it's gone. So when you detonate a warhead that's full of little tungsten steel balls, all it's got to do is puncture that engine, and that's it. It's over. They lost a whole bunch of aircraft, and the rest of them turned around and ran home. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know what was shooting them down. So that's some scary technology. Scary technology. All right, that was my morning babble. I like to babble going down the road, and that's just something I was thinking about today. I'll catch up with you guys later. Take care.